Hey everybody, today's Epic Shootout is between the Panasonic GH5 and the Olympus OMD EM1 Mark II. Both of these cameras are 20 megapixel micro 4/3 sensor format cameras. They both have IBIS, which is internal body image stabilization. They both have articulating touchscreen monitors. They both have dual SD card slots, though the OMD only has one UHS 2 slot. They both are loaded with video features. Specifically, when we look at the GH5, we see 10-bit 422 internal 4K chroma subsampling, which is amazing if you know what that is. We have internal 4K 60 frames per second at 8-bit 420, and we also have a high frame rate mode that allows us to shoot up to 180 frames per second in 1080, which is great for slow motion. On the Olympus side, we see a number of great features for high frame rate still actions, including 18 frames per second in the electronic shutter mode. We get continuous tracking. For the mechanical shutter, we get 10 frames per second, but we also have this feature called Pro Capture, which allows the camera to capture up to 60 frames per second in RAW, as well as a high resolution mode, which will allow us to capture 50 to 80 megapixel images, which does it by tilting the IBIS in different directions during the shot. Very interesting, very fascinating. The OMD is highly waterproof. It's lighter. This is a shootout for the ages. Many of you ask about the lenses that I use in these tests. In this case, I'm using the Panasonic 12-35 2.8 image stabilized version 2 on the GH5. On the Olympus, I'm using the 12-40 2.8 non-image stabilized lens, but in some of the tests, like the charts and the ISO tests, I'm using that Olympus. I think the Olympus is a little bit sharper. That's another video. They both have their merits. My Epic Shootouts are intended to be informative. If I point something out about a camera that you own, please don't take it personally. I'm just trying to let buyers know this is something that I'm seeing and they might see if they buy it too. I'm trying to forewarn them, but I'm trying to be as objective as possible. Whenever I do tests, I publish my methodologies. So if there's any question about what I did, if I made a mistake, I can make it right. Or you might want to go out and do the tests on your own. You'll probably come to the same conclusions. I'm trying to make the world's best hands-on camera testing videos in my Epic Shootouts. Something else you'll be interested to know is I have training videos for both of these cameras in the Panasonic GH5 and in the OMD EM1 Mark II. I have full tutorials. If you are a beginning or an intermediate photographer, I will get you up to speed in no time, show you how to take great stills, great video, and I highly recommend it if this is your first camera. The first test I'd like to get into is focusing. So let's go over to the park and take a look at sports focusing first. Something that I like to do when I get new mirrorless cameras is test the ability to maintain focus during a rack zoom. In the past, some of the other cameras, when you're zooming during a burst, for whatever reason, it loses focus. So I need to do some preliminary tests. And a few things that I'm noticing, the OMD has many burst modes far faster than what we're about to test. For example, Pro Capture can shoot at 60 frames per second, and you can also shoot as an electronic mode, and you can also shoot mechanically at 15 frames per second, but the problem with those, that is autofocus single. We don't get the tracking, and so in order to get tracking, you have to be on the low sequential burst. So 10 frames per second, autofocus continuous, and then we get the tracking. A couple things I'm noticing about the EM1 Mark II is we get 121 phase detection points, 80% coverage through the viewfinder versus 100% on the GH5 with 225 contrast detection. So phase detection is usually a little bit better than contrast. When I look through the viewfinder on the EM1 Mark II, with sunglasses that are polarized, I do get some distortion in the viewfinder, not getting that with the GH5. So those are just a few little nuances to keep in mind. So Ashley, I'm gonna have you run down real quick. Count of 3, 1, 2, 3. So you can hear as I'm zooming, the camera's struggling. You can't even get the 8 frames per second. And I have it set up to release on continuous mode. So in order for me to get accurate results side by side, we're gonna go ahead and do no zoom during a burst, and then we'll be able to see a comparison in terms of the focusing systems only. For side-to-side accuracy of a moving subject using continuous autofocus with a mechanical shutter, the OMD EM1 Mark II scored a near perfect 99%, with the GH5 scoring a 97%. Really, no significant difference. For a forward-moving subject in good light, the EM1 Mark II scored an 88% and the GH5 a 90%. For a subject moving away into heavy backlight, the Olympus scored an 87% and the GH5 a 95%. So statistically, what does this all mean? Basically, that both cameras do really well for sports shooting as long as you are not racking the zoom ring during a burst. Because of this limitation, neither of these cameras would be my first choice for a sports shooting camera, but as the tests show, if you shoot within their capabilities, you will have a high percentage of keepers. So a camera's buffer performance is how many shots you can take until the camera runs out of space and it starts to slow down or shut off. Another part of this is how fast it can clear the memory card. So we have two super fast UHS-2 cards, the Lexar 2000X. They're in both cameras, and we are going to put the cameras on RAW, 10 frames per second on the OMD, 9 frames per second on the GH5, and listen to see how many shots we get off before it starts to slow down. Count of three. 1, 2, 3, go. There it goes. You can hear it that as it's clearing, you're able to get a couple more shots off. So sounded like 50 or 60 easily, maybe more. I'd have to actually sit down and count them. Suffice it to say, if you're shooting on RAW in a continuous burst, it's going to be enough to cover most situations. So let's take a look at the OMD EM1 Mark II. Ready, go. There it goes. So it's slowed down. Sounds like that once it gets through its initial capacity, it's able to clear a little bit faster, but pretty comparable, about the same. You're going to be able to get a burst off with either of these cameras on RAW. Let's do this. Let's switch it over to RAW and JPEG fine and see if we can slow it down a little bit faster. So RAW and JPEG, here we go. Count of three. 1, 2, 3, go. Again, did great. I mean, you're going to be able to do most burst situations, no problem. With RAW and JPEG, I don't think it's going to be an issue with the GH5. Let's take a look again at the OMD EM1 Mark II. JPEG and RAW. Ready, go. Oh, interesting. Filled up a little bit quicker. A little bit shorter burst there on the JPEG and RAW. Interesting stuff. So which of these two cameras do I believe is a better sports shooting camera? That is a really tough one to call, simply because the EM1 Mark II has more burst options. It can do 18 frames per second in electronic mode, but I didn't see significant difference in focusing accuracy. It seemed as though the GH5 stood its ground. And I would suggest that you would get comparable results with both cameras in a sports shooting scenario if you have the settings dialed in correctly. In my low light focusing test, I have two high contrast targets, one at 6.0 EV and the other at -1.6 EV, and I focus back and forth for 30 repetitions, timing the total with each camera on multiple tests and then taking the averages. Without an autofocus assist lamp, the OMD EM1 Mark II scored an average of 58.5 seconds. The GH5 scored an average of 45.2 seconds. So the win here for low light focusing is the GH5. We did multiple days of video focusing tests, and this is what I can tell you. With the right amount of tweaking, you can get the autofocus for video to work on the GH5. Just know that it's inconsistent, and that's what was so frustrating about it. I couldn't reliably predict how it would perform from situation to situation. Sometimes it was fine, and other times it was not good at all. The Olympus, on the other hand, was very straightforward, fast and easy to use, tracks video very well. If autofocus for video is important to you, I would strongly recommend the EM1 Mark II over the GH5. When it comes to still images of a color chart, side by side, both cameras perform very similar. I would have to call this one a tie in terms of the chart. However, I also like to look at high ISO performance on portraits to find out what the differences are in noise repression for JPEGs, and I see this as softening or a loss of sharpness. Between ISO 800 and 1600, the GH5 runs into problems with over softening in the eyes. It's very easy to see. Regardless, this is an improvement over what we saw in the GH4, but expect that ISO 800 will be safe for most portraits and occasionally 1600. By 3200, the eyes become far too soft, and by 6400, it's unusable. On the EM1 Mark II side, I think it's between 400 and 800. Take a look at what happens at higher ISOs. And of course, subject matter will make a difference, and they both handled the green paint inside this batter's box well, but I think the GH5 has an advantage when it comes to handling flesh tones at higher ISOs, and I give the GH5 the win for high ISO performance for portraits. In my dynamic range tests, I use something called a Stover wedge, which has 41 ND filters at 1/3 stop intervals. I use a flash and capture each camera's ability to differentiate between each of those filters. I inspect for the point at which each border is no longer visible, and in this test, I noticed something very interesting. Never seen something quite like this before. At ISO 200, I think the EM1 Mark II has a slight advantage when it comes to distinguishing between different shades. I'd say between 35 and 36. With the GH5, I think it's between 33 and 34. However, when we look at the noise grain of the GH5, it is cleaner noise-wise, and this has been a plague for Micro Four Thirds cameras at higher ISOs. As we get darker, the GH5 is more consistent. As we move up to ISO 800, they become more comparable, almost identical, and by 1600, they're both showing high amounts of grain, very similar. In a side-by-side dynamic range test, I think this is about as close as you can get. The EM1 Mark II has a slight advantage in terms of shade distinction, and the GH5 has a grain advantage. Out of curiosity, I decided to compare the GH5 to the GH4, and interestingly, I didn't see a huge difference in terms of shade differentiation. However, again, the grain performance improvement on the GH5, as well as the consistency, really stood out, and this is a welcome improvement. Both cameras feature an HDR mode, which allows them to take multiple exposures and combine those images in camera to create an image with detail in both the highlights as well as the shadows. It's very fast in both cameras, and I have to give the win here to the Olympus because it creates a gorgeous image as well as a single raw file for the HDR shot. While we're limited JPEG only in the GH5, I think the final HDR shots look better too, but there are also multiple HDR modes in the EM1 Mark II. Moire is a splotchy artifact that sometimes can be seen in certain patterns like this lined golf shirt. While both cameras lack anti-aliasing filters, which can sometimes help reduce moire, it is clearly present in both. When comparing side by side, however, at least in the case of my golf shirt, the win here goes to the OMD EM1 Mark II. I think it's cleaner for moire. Take a look at the video test of these color charts. And what I'm looking for is dancing pixels. At full size, ISO 400 and even 800, they are very comparable. But we noticed something interesting when we compared side by side and we zoomed in on the red swatch. Watch this really carefully. As we increase the ISO, we start to see more dancing pixels on the Olympus. A very distinct advantage for reds on the GH5. And then we repeat the test for candles, slowly increasing the ISO. And what I'm looking for is the midtones between the candle and the dark shadows. And I'm looking for grain. Again, around 1600, we start to see a slight advantage for the GH5. And by 3200, both of them are in trouble. As we increase the ISO, they become less and less usable. There are some cameras on the market that overheat when recording 4K video. I used a forward-looking infrared radar device to measure the heat signatures of both cameras after 20 minutes of 4K video recording. The Panasonic GH5 scored one of the lowest ever in this test at 91 degrees Fahrenheit, and the OMD EM1ii scored 99 degrees Fahrenheit. While you probably won't see either of these cameras overheating much, if at all, the win for heat signatures goes to the Panasonic GH5. Rolling shutter, also sometimes referred to as the jello effect, is when we see a delay or a shift in movement of vertical subjects after panning. It's important to note that you should turn your image stabilization off when you're on a tripod or a fluid head, as we did for this initial test, and you can see that both cameras have really good side-to-side panning performance. Very little jello effect. Slight advantage to the OMD EM1ii, but it's actually pretty good in both cameras. However, this gave me an idea to use the rolling shutter test to see what's happening with IBIS. So I repeated the tests with in-body image stabilization on and panned left to right. Interestingly, the EM1ii was great. Look how fast the light stand stops. The GH5, however, has a very slight delay in motion after it stops. This is clearly a result of the IBIS overcorrecting. It's something I also saw when I was walking handheld. It's almost this side-to-side shift. I even did tests with both cameras hand holding for video, and I would have to give a very slight advantage to the Olympus, which has the best IBIS I have ever seen in any camera. Even with non-image stabilized lenses, it performed very well. Paired with its 12-100, it's amazing. You can almost get away with walking shots handheld if it weren't for some of the overcorrection in the corners. The GH5 IBIS is very good, but it excels especially with the new 12-35 2.8 IS V2, and it's worth the extra expense, but that is another video. I shot a ton of video on both cameras, and while the looks and settings can be tweaked endlessly, here's what I can tell you. Number one, the exposure settings are not identical between cameras. Secondly, is that the EM1ii comes with a flat profile, and I think it's the best for its video modes, just my opinion. The GH5 has far greater options in terms of profiles, but you need to spend $100 for its vlog profile, which is a bummer. The EM1ii has a high bitrate C4K mode at 237 megabits per second, which is gorgeous, but because I shoot at 30 frames per second, I am not including it in this test. Just take my word, it looks amazing. The GH5 is super clean and crisp. There's something about it that just feels like it has a little bit more punch, and I love the look even on a standard mode. Take a look at this tree side by side and look at the detail in the bark. The GH5 seemed to be able to pull more detail out of the shadows. Take a look at these two horizons. Obviously, with the right amount of tweaking, you can get the clouds properly exposed in both cameras, but exposure for exposure, it seemed like the EM1ii was better at getting details and highlights. Again, take a look at the crashing surf here on the right. Watch the waves as they hit the rocks. Again, more detail on the highlights for the EM1ii, better shadow detail on the GH5. So what I'm trying to say is I think the GH5 has the advantage in terms of the look and the options and the tweaks. I think the EM1 Mark II has the advantage in its IBIS for video, which is huge. And if I was to make a suggestion to Olympus, you have a dual quad-core processor in your camera. If you would just add a few more little tweaks, like a high frame rate, like 4K 60 frames per second, a couple little other tweaks, you are going to be competing side by side against that GH5. So keep that in mind. The EM1 Mark II does not get the credit it deserves as a video camera, but for the video look and quality, I think I'm going to give the win here to the GH5. Grab a pen and a piece of paper and list it from 1 to 12 and write down whether you like the left image, A, or the right image, B, more. Pause the video if you need some extra time. Don't think about it too much, just look at the images, follow your gut instinct. This has been very popular to determine which image quality you will prefer more for portraits. One side note I need to make is that when I do these tests, I try to get all the settings and apertures and focal lengths to as close as identical as possible, trying to capture different models in different lighting conditions, including shade, bright sunlight, backlight, and different ISO settings, things of that nature. So just go through the test, write them down, and I'll give you the answers at the end. So are you ready for the answers? Here they are. Score which camera you liked more, and that will give you a really good indication of which image quality you prefer for portraits. We're talking about the ease of use and the ergonomics. They're very comparable. The touchscreen articulating monitors are amazing on both cameras. I kind of like the grip on the GH5 a little bit more. It's a little bit beefier. I love the joystick. On the OMD EM1 Mark II, I like the weight, and I like that it's weather sealed and weatherproofed. The OMD EM1 Mark II is a little bit harder to learn, in my opinion. I thought it was a harder camera to figure out. I'd never shot with an Olympus before, but the lightweight and the compact size is also an advantage. So it's kind of a wash between the two. A little bit more weight with the GH5, but you're getting a little bit better grip and things of that nature. Ease of operation, slight advantage to the GH5. If you are a Micro Four Third camera owner, definitely check out the Micro Four Third forum at mu-43.com. It's probably one of the best resources on the internet for information about the Micro Four Third format sensor size. So, in conclusion, which camera would I recommend to what kind of photographer, and which camera am I going to be using most of the time from here on out? Great questions. Olympus, you've done a great job with the EM1 Mark II. I was very impressed with it. It's my first Olympus camera. In all honesty, when I first purchased it in the beginning part of the year, I was like, yeah, I'll use this for about 3 weeks. And I have kept it ever since. I can't get rid of it. And the reason is because I keep finding interesting things about it. The things that really stand out to me about the EM1 Mark II is that it's a more well-rounded camera. It can do lots of things very well. It's like a Swiss Army knife of a camera. The high resolution mode, which allows you to take 50 megapixels, 80 megapixel images with a camera this size, is incredible. I like the weight. I like the weather sealing. You see YouTube videos of people putting this under faucets. I love the Pro Capture. I love all of the different types of high frame rate auto focusing modes. 18 frames per second on electronic mode. That is insane. I love that it has 2 SD card slots. I wish that both of them were UHS 2. The big negative for me about the OMD EM1 Mark II, and this is something I'm going to try to do, is be a little bit more forward about the things that I don't like about the cameras, is mainly its price. I think if Olympus comes down $200 or $300, they are going to be very competitive. And the reason why I say that is you look at the Fuji X-T2, which is an incredible camera, $1,600. So that's the biggest negative I have about the EM1 Mark II is its price. There are a few other little things I didn't like, but for the most part, this is a home run camera. If you haven't heard about it, it is absolutely incredible, and it's been an absolute pleasure learning to shoot with it. Highly recommend it if you do a lot of traveling and you need to stay lightweight, but you need a camera that can do kind of everything. Now, the Panasonic GH5, the camera that I'm shooting with right now, is definitely more geared for videographers. I think we all agree on that. It brings too much to the table for videographers. We're talking about the high frame rate, 180 frames per second, 10-bit internal 422, 4K. That's pretty much unheard of. It's groundbreaking in my opinion. And then we look at things like 4K 60 frames per second, internal image stabilization combined with that 12 to 35 version 2. It is insane. Both of these cameras you can shoot video handheld. You won't need a monopod or even a tripod. If you just handhold with the image stabilizations, you're going to be able to pull off most of your shots. That is a very exciting front for me, is to not need all these gimbals and to shoot with a smaller and smaller footprint. I did a portrait shoot for a family a couple weeks ago where I had both cameras side by side and I was shooting with both of them. And during the shoot, I put my sunglasses on, and that electronic viewfinder in the OMD, it interfered with my sunglasses. I couldn't see through the viewfinder. So I switched over to the GH5 and did most of the shoot with the GH5, and it was a home run success. Typically, if you do a portrait shoot really well, the family will order like 1 or 2 canvas prints. This family ordered 11 canvas prints. All the images were taken with the GH5. I used that 35 to 100 Panasonic lens. I should make a video about that shoot. It was very interesting, but very good portrait camera. Both cameras did great for sports shooting. I didn't see any huge differences in their ability to track a moving subject. On the GH5, the main negative drawback for me, and I think a lot of people agree on this, is the autofocus for video. I thought it was not good. It's not a camera, you know, my photographer friends are the ones who are complaining about this. My videographer friends who have been shooting with manual focus for years, it's not a big deal. It's the hybrid shooters coming from the photography side. They want that autofocus. If you compare it to something like the A6300 or the A6500 or Canon dual pixel autofocus, it's night and day. Those cameras are insane for autofocus during video, but it's not a deal breaker for me because I typically shoot with manual focus anyway. And for everything that the GH5 brings to the table with these extra video features, it is a video maker's dream. If you're a videographer, I would strongly recommend taking a look at the GH5. And again, it can take great stills and things of that nature. The GH5 is going to become my A camera for the video productions. I'm shooting on it right now with an Olympus lens. I think the Olympus lens is a little bit better for shooting on sticks. Have some videos coming on that soon. That is my epic shootout on the Panasonic GH5 and the Olympus OMD EM1 Mark II. Let me say thank you guys so much for your support over the years. I really appreciate it. I know I've been out of the loop. I wrote a book. It's just getting published. So hopefully I can make some more YouTube videos. In any event, thank you guys so much, and I will see you next time. I would love to give you a free copy of my new book, The Efficiency Playbook, which launches July 22nd, 2017. If you're signed up for my newsletter before then, I will send you a free Kindle download link as soon as it's available for a limited time only. And if you have a GH5 or an EM1 Mark II and are struggling to learn them, I have excellent crash courses on both of them. I'll teach you the basics and show you how to shoot like a pro in no time. All of these links are in the description.